Howdy, it's Kyle talking about New York City. I've posted about 150 videos or so about the US and not a single one about the largest city in the country, so in this video I want to rectify that. The reason why I haven't discussed New York before is because prior to September 22, I hadn't been to the city since April of '01, so before the terrorist attack, and I didn't feel comfortable talking about a city that I hadn't been to in over 20 years, but I got a chance to spend 4 days there walking around just seeing the city, and in this video I'm going to talk about some of the things that I saw. First, some general information. The city of New York is made up of 5 different boroughs. Each one is its own county, so that means New York is the only city in the country in which the city government supersedes the county governments. At the 2020 census, the city had a population of just over 8.8 million, and all 5 boroughs saw population increase from 2010. But since 2020, all 5 boroughs have been losing population, and the current estimates have the city at about 8,460,000. But for this video, I'm only going to be talking about Manhattan, which is New York County, and the current population there is just under 1.6 million and decreasing. Throughout this video, I'm going to be going back and forth between this map and showing images and footage of individual areas, but this shows Manhattan Island, or New York County. Over here at the west end of the map is New Jersey. This is the Hudson River, which is the state line. Brooklyn's down here. Queens is here. Bronx is up here. And at the bottom of the map is where you have Ellis Island and Statue of Liberty. So coming up into the city itself, downtown is where you have the tallest high-rises, the World Trade Center, Wall Street, a lot of the financial stuff. Up here is Greenwich Village and Soho. Over here is Alphabet City, Midtown. Some of the most iconic New York sites are here. Central Park. The areas to the west of Central Park are called the Upper West Side. To the east, the Upper East Side. And you get north of there, Harlem, East Harlem, which used to be referred to as Spanish Harlem, Columbia University, and you get farther up north, you get into Washington Heights and Inwood at the north end of the city. So I'm going to zoom in here. I stayed in a hotel over here, West 46th Street in the Hell's Kitchen area near Times Square. This is where you have the big touristy area. A lot of folks are surprised when they visit New York to learn that Times Square is the big tourist trap part of the city, but it is. It's not a big business district for a lot of locals. So but very iconic stuff around here. But the first day I was in New York, I just spent the entire day walking around the Upper West Side, which is this area right here. On the day that I was walking around the West Side, I walked up this whole area here, up to about Columbia University, and then back down the Riverside. And most of the Upper West Side is going to be pretty nice. There isn't a whole lot of blight in this part of the city. It's also a fairly safe part of the city. I walked around by myself late at night, almost every night I was there. But for tourists, the Upper West Side isn't the most interesting part of the city, which is why I think it's a pretty cool part, because it's mostly just locals just going about their day. Going back to this map, the next day I spent walking around the entire Upper East Side. So you look over here on the east side of the park. For the most part, this is a kind of a wealthier area. You have Park Avenue, Fifth Avenue, and just some of the more high-end kind of stuff in this part of the city. A way that many of the most high-end buildings differentiate themselves from some of the other ones is with an awning. It's a very simple addition, but you know if you're going into a building with an awning, it's probably much more expensive than ones that don't. And another way to tell you're in some of the wealthier parts of the city is that the buildings have a doorman. I don't know much about doorman culture, but it's a unionized gig, and all the ones that I saw were middle-aged or older men, so that tells me it's a good old boys club that's hard to get into. Something else you'll see a lot of in the east side are nannies. And the east side is where you're going to see a whole lot of white babies being pushed around in strollers by a woman speaking Spanish. And on the east side, there's a lot more stuff that's not residential. This is where you have the main museums, the Met and the Guggenheim, several other museums, as well as Hunter College and Roosevelt University. But once you get north of the Upper East Side, you get into East Harlem up here, which is a much more lower income area. There's been talk of too much gentrification going on in this neighborhood and some of the culture being lost, but the parts of East Harlem that I saw, I didn't really see many signs of gentrification, so it is going on in this area, but it isn't the entire area that's being gentrified. I was walking up Lexington Avenue, and because of Lou Reed, I had to walk up to Lexington 125, but I didn't see many signs of gentrification over there where I was walking. I think it's when you get to some of the more well-known parts of Harlem, like along 125th, where you're seeing some more gentrification. And East Harlem is very racially and ethnically diverse. There are Hispanics from different ethnicities, many different black ethnicities. There are African Americans, but there are also, I heard, some African French and also some Caribbean French Creole. I wasn't sure exactly if it was Haitian or what, but a lot of different folks living in this part of town, many different Asian groups. So very racially diverse, except for white folks. There were no white folks around here. When you go west of East Harlem, you get to Central Harlem. This is the area just north of the end of Central Park, and this is the part of Harlem that has seen quite a bit of gentrification through the years. So if you're expecting the old Harlem of the 70s and 80s, you're not going to find it in this part of town. And then just west of Harlem is the campus of Columbia University, an Ivy League school. So I found it very interesting that there's a campus of a university right in the middle of Manhattan, and there's also New York University, or NYU, but that isn't really a campus. It's just more of a collection of high-rises downtown, but Columbia does actually have a campus right there in Manhattan. Once you get north of Harlem, you get into Washington Heights and Inwood, and I did not explore this part of the city, but this is the poorest part of town. This is where you have the highest crime rates, but I think there's also some gentrification going on in this part of Manhattan as well, so I guess nowhere on the island is safe from the new development. I spent the next day walking around this part of town here, which is Midtown and Midtown South, and this is where you have some of the most iconic sites in New York, including Madison Square Garden, the Empire State Building, Radio City Music Hall, and just many other sites like that. So if you're a tourist, you might very well be spending a lot of time here, but not everything in this part of town is geared towards tourists. This is probably the most chaotic part of the city in terms of walking, and you really have to be on your toes as a pedestrian. At the east end of Midtown is the UN headquarters, and while I was there was something big going on there, and that whole part of town was kind of shut down. At the west end of Midtown South is the trendy Chelsea neighborhood. This is where you have a lot of outdoor cafes as well as a large Chelsea market. A relatively new development along the west side of Midtown is the High Line. This is a repurposed elevated train line that's been turned into a pedestrian-only path. I was a little disappointed to see that it was pretty much just tourists that were on this thing, but I found it very interesting because it's a really quick way to get from, say, 30th down to 10th. You can skip all the stoplights, you're above the street level, and you can really make some ground walking on the High Line. And all along this way, it's a nice neighborhood, really expensive buildings, and some pretty cool architecture as well. Just north of Chelsea is the Hudson Yards area, which is also a fairly recent development. From talking to people, I got the impression that many are not big on the whole Hudson Yards development. The area does look nice and the architecture is pretty cool, but I think the issue is that it's high-end luxury apartments, and if there's one thing New York does not need right now, it's more high-end luxury condos. And I think many New Yorkers view the Hudson Yards as a wasted opportunity. There isn't much space in Manhattan, so you have to be really careful with what you do with that space. And the fourth day I was there, I spent the entire time walking around downtown. In other parts of the city, it's almost impossible to get lost, but once you get downtown, the streets get a little bit more complicated and you might get turned around a little bit. The financial district is right downtown, and in talking to locals, I got the impression that the area isn't as busy as it used to be. I think many of the jobs going on in the high-rises downtown can be done from home. I'm not sure what the financial district was like in 2019. It seemed pretty busy when I was walking around, but I can understand how it would have been much busier prior to the pandemic. North of the financial district is Chinatown and Little Italy, which are directly adjacent to each other. Chinatown appeared to be pretty authentic. I didn't see many signs of gentrification around here, and most of the people that I saw were in fact Chinese and speaking what was presumably either Mandarin or Cantonese. Next to that is Little Italy, where you had one of the largest Italian immigrant populations in the U.S. When I was there was a big street fair going on, the streets were closed down, and the restaurants were packed. And because the restaurants were so packed, I wasn't able to eat Italian food while I was there, so I sucked it up and ate lunch at Eileen's Cheesecake a couple of blocks away. And this place is so good. They sell really small snack-sized cheesecakes of different types. You can order a couple different ones, and wow, they're good. So I got to be a New York tourist and have a cheesecake lunch. And then north of Little Italy is where you have Greenwich Village, West Village, and Soho. I would say this is the most lively nightlife part of the city. I went out with some friends one night and we were out till 4 in the morning in Greenwich Village. And this area in the village in Soho was super packed with people, even though it was a weekday night that we were out there. But one thing I heard many people say is that the nightlife in the city is overall down compared to how it was before the pandemic. I was talking to a couple of bartenders in the Hell's Kitchen area, and they said that before the pandemic, there were so many bars around there, and they were all open till 4 in the morning, and it was packed every night. But now, a lot of these bars are closing at midnight. I was sitting at one of these bars, and the lights came on at 11:45, and I'm thinking, it's not even tomorrow yet. How are the lights on? That definitely did not seem to be the case in the Village and Soho, but in other parts of the city that have a nightlife type district, it's been hurt a lot by the pandemic. Next, I want to talk about Central Park, which is probably the most well-known urban park in the world. It's a big park that has a lot going on besides green space and lakes. And even though it doesn't look like it's that big to the point where you could get lost, you definitely can get lost there. There's just so much there. There are thick wooded areas for hiking and others for birding. There's a large lake there. There are ball fields and tennis courts. You also have a little pond for RC boats and model sailboats. There's just so much there that it doesn't look like it's this enormous piece of land, but once you're down in there, you can see just how big it is and what a wonderful park it is. I did not spend an entire day at the park, but you certainly can. And some of the most expensive buildings in the city are the ones right along the park, especially ones with a view of the park. I also wanted to mention a couple of islands off of Manhattan. One is the long and narrow Roosevelt Island, which is in the East River between Manhattan and Queens. The island has a population of over 11,000 people and is mostly car-free. And even though it's right there in the middle of the city, it's kind of isolated. There's very limited access to it. The Queensboro Bridge in the foreground there doesn't actually provide access to the island, and that smaller bridge in the back only connects it to Queens, not Manhattan. Cornell University has a tech campus on the island, and right now they're trying to make this island into a pedestrian and bike-only oasis. There are a few islands south of the city. Here is Governor's Island. It's fairly large. It's mostly green space and a park. Nobody lives there, but they do have concerts and other events there, and part of it is actually a national monument. Down here you have Liberty Island, which is where the Statue of Liberty is, and this is owned by, or part of, New York. And up here is Ellis Island, which is where you had the big immigrant checkpoint, and this is both New York and New Jersey. I'm not sure how this works, but both claim it. Either way, these are some of the more important islands south of the city. So next up, the cost of living, and as we all know, it's pretty expensive to live there, but just how expensive? In most videos like this, I take a look at house listings, but for New York, I'll be looking at rental apartments, and this is one of the cheapest ones I could find. It's a small studio, but it's off of 205th Street, so you're way away from any of the main parts of Manhattan, but you're still paying at least $1,600 a month for it. This is just about the cheapest one that I could find in a decent building in Midtown. People that want to live in Manhattan don't care that much about space, which is good because you're not going to get that much of it. And these 3 photos show the entire apartment. Here's another one about the same size, but it's a little bit nicer. It's been updated, but the part of town it's in is not as nice as the previous one. This is about the cheapest one that I could find that wasn't a studio. This is a 1-bedroom, although it's still very small. So this is about as cheap as it gets if you're a couple and want a 1-bedroom. This is just about the cheapest one that I could find that's within 1 block of Central Park. But that's a pretty big premium to live near the park. And if you want to live on the Upper East Side, well, you're going to have to add a premium to that. This place is pretty big for New York, but man, $3,500 a month. And New York does have some pretty big apartments. This one's 3,500 square feet for only $19,000 a month. So guys, check out my Patreon page. Help me move into this place. Next, I want to talk about the crime rate, and the total numbers of crime are going to be a lot higher in New York than any other place because it's just so much larger, but the overall crime rate is nowhere near as high as some of the most dangerous cities in the country. The east side and west side of Central Park are the safest parts of the city, and once you go north of that is where you get to the higher crime areas, but also farther down downtown is where you have some of the higher crime rates as well. There's going to be a lot of theft, purse snatching, and pickpocketing around Times Square and some of the other major touristy areas. There have been some issues with assault and theft on the subways, especially during 2020 and 21 when there were fewer people riding them and just less strength in numbers. I felt very safe walking around by myself even at night, although I do know which part of town to avoid. I wasn't going to be walking around Alphabet City or East Harlem at night. I don't want to make light of the crime because it is a very serious issue, but I'm also not going to sensationalize it. So all in all, I really enjoyed my time in New York, and I look forward to getting back there and exploring some more. And even though we're not looking to move to New York anytime soon, I can understand why people do want to live there and are willing to pay the higher premium to live there, because there's nowhere else on earth like Manhattan. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please give me a thumbs up to let me know you approve, and subscribe to this channel if you're interested in learning more about geography. I'm doing city videos like this, talking about states, ranking things in all kinds of different categories, and I'm a bit of a nerd, so everything comes from a nerdy type perspective. But yeah, thanks for watching. Geography King, signing out. I'd like to give a special thanks to my superior patrons for their support, especially the mysterious Robert A. from I don't know where. But if you're interested in buying a pin for the viewer pin map that I'll update every now and then, or just to support the channel, check out my Patreon page, link in the description. And as always, thanks a lot.